Imagine being told that the only way to establish law and order in a town completely overrun by heavily armed, bloodthirsty psychopaths was to hire a man who was exponentially more violent, significantly more ruthless, and infinitely more terrifying than the worst criminals crawling the streets. They were told that this man, a towering, heavily scarred veteran with an explosive temper and a notorious reputation for utilizing extreme, lethal force, was going to wear a silver badge and act as the shield of the innocent, completely ignoring the fact that he was actually a walking apocalypse who viewed the badge not as a symbol of peace, but as a legally sanctioned license to absolutely annihilate anyone who dared to cross his path. Before we dive headfirst into the incredibly dark, blood-soaked history of the most dangerous, unstable, and mechanically lethal lawmen to ever patrol the American frontier, I need to know exactly who is standing on the line with us today. So I want you to drop your city in the comments below right now to map out our global battalion, proving that our squad of historical truth seekers is ready to dissect the raw, unfiltered, and deeply uncomfortable reality of the Wild West without any of the sanitized Hollywood censorship. We are opening the heavily redacted, incredibly violent file on Dallas Stoudenmire, a man born in Alabama who desperately attempted to join the Confederate Army at the incredibly tender age of 15. Possessing a terrifyingly aggressive, primal drive for combat that would eventually define every single bloody chapter of his chaotic existence. After being initially discharged for his youth, he relentlessly re-enlisted, surviving multiple brutal combat wounds and deeply internalizing the horrific mechanical slaughter of the American Civil War, transforming from a simple farm boy into a hardened, deeply traumatized apex predator who fundamentally understood that human life was completely fragile, and that absolute, overwhelming violence was the only truly effective method of communication in a hostile environment. He carried this incredibly dark, deeply scarred psychological profile with him as he drifted across the blood-soaked plains of Texas, eventually arriving in 1881 in the sprawling, sun-baked, completely lawless border town of El Paso, a terrifyingly remote settlement that was geographically isolated from any form of civilized government and completely dominated by a ruthless syndicate of corrupt politicians, vicious cattle rustlers, and heavily armed murderers who essentially ran the town as their own personal kingdom. The local authorities were either heavily bribed, completely terrified, or actively participating in the daily slaughter, resulting in an environment so profoundly unstable that the city council desperately reached out into the frontier darkness and hired Stoudenmire, a man notorious for his massive physical stature, his uncontrollable alcohol-fueled temper, and his chilling, sociopathic willingness to kill without a microscopic fraction of a second of hesitation. Stoudenmire did not operate like a traditional, romanticized lawman who relied on a fast draw from a low-hanging leather holster, because he understood the absolute, unforgiving physics of close-quarters combat better than any man alive, realizing that the traditional holster draw required too much wasted kinetic motion and completely telegraphed his lethal intentions to his enemies. Instead, Stoudenmire utilized a brilliantly customized, highly unconventional, and deeply terrifying tactical advantage, employing a local tailor to specially line the front pockets of his heavy trousers with thick, smooth leather, perfectly designed to securely hold two massive, heavily modified Smith & Wesson Schofield revolvers. These specific weapons were engineering marvels of their time, featuring a top brake mechanism that allowed for extremely rapid reloading and a heavy, devastating .44 caliber payload that could completely obliterate human bone and tissue upon impact. This ingenious, physics-defying modification allowed him to comfortably walk the incredibly dangerous streets of El Paso, with his hands casually resting inside his pockets, looking completely relaxed and entirely unarmed to the untrained eye, while his fingers were already securely wrapped around the cold iron grips and resting directly on the hair triggers of his weapons, mathematically reducing his draw time to absolute zero, and allowing him to unleash a devastating barrage of high-caliber lead before his opponents even realized a gunfight had commenced. The absolute climax of Stoudenmire's terrifying reign, the precise moment where his brilliant mechanical preparation and absolute lack of psychological hesitation resulted in one of the most famous, heavily analyzed, and brutally efficient underdog victories in the history of the frontier occurred a mere 3 days after he pinned the Silver Star to his chest. An event forever burned into the history books as the 4 dead in 5 seconds gunfight. The chaotic sequence of events was initially triggered by the cold-blooded, highly political assassination of a Texas Ranger. A murder that instantly ignited a powder keg of tension and brought 2 heavily armed factions into a claustrophobic, incredibly tense confrontation in the center of El Paso's dusty, sun-drenched streets, surrounded by completely terrified bystanders and corrupt local officials who were fully prepared to execute the new marshal. As the hostile verbal exchange rapidly deteriorated and hands twitched violently toward heavy iron revolvers, a corrupt local politician and notorious killer named John Hale, who was heavily involved in the preceding assassination, cowardly pulled his weapon and fired a devastating, point-blank shot that instantly killed an innocent bystander, sending a massive, deafening shockwave echoing off the wooden storefronts and instantly plunging the street into absolute, terrifying chaos. In that exact fraction of a second, while normal men violently flinched and desperately scrambled for cover, Staudenmayer's deeply ingrained, combat-hardened neurological pathways bypassed all conscious thought, executing a flawless, predetermined kinetic response. With his hands already deep inside his leather-lined pockets, holding the heavy grips of his concealed revolvers, Staudenmayer did not waste precious milliseconds aggressively yanking the weapons upward into his line of sight. Instead, he simply angled the iron barrels through the thick fabric of his trousers and fired a massive, concussive round directly through his own clothing. A brilliant, highly unorthodox tactical maneuver that completely caught his enemies off guard and instantly established overwhelming fire superiority. His first heavy lead projectile violently tore through the air, completely missing Hale, but instantly striking another armed combatant, permanently removing him from the terrifying equation before he could even raise his weapon. An incredible display of rapid threat assessment and immediate lethal engagement. Hale, terrified by the sudden explosive retaliation and realizing he was dealing with an absolute monster, desperately turned and attempted to flee behind a thick adobe pillar, seeking physical cover from the relentless barrage of gunfire. But Staudenmayer's understanding of angles, trajectory, and human anatomy was absolutely unparalleled. As Hale peeked his head out from behind the solid adobe structure to assess the situation, Staudenmayer coldly and mathematically calculated the exact distance, leveled his heavy revolver with terrifying, surgical precision, and squeezed the trigger, unleashing a massive, high-velocity projectile that traveled across the dusty street and violently impacted Hale directly between the eyes, instantly snapping his head back and dropping him completely lifeless into the dirt. An incredibly precise, devastatingly lethal shot, executed in the absolute peak of adrenaline-fueled combat. But the terrifying 5-second apocalypse was not over, as a former city marshal named George Campbell, who had previously drawn his weapon and was caught directly in the crossfire, aggressively raised his own revolver and desperately fired at Staudenmayer, his heavy bullet screaming through the air and missing the lawman by absolute fractions of an inch. An incredibly dangerous miscalculation that instantly sealed his fate. Staudenmayer, operating with the cold, mechanical efficiency of an industrial slaughterhouse, instantly pivoted his massive frame, completely ignored the deafening roar of the near miss, locked his eyes onto Campbell, and fired 2 rapid, deeply concussive rounds that slammed violently into Campbell's torso. The massive kinetic energy of the heavy lead bullets physically lifting the man off his feet and throwing him backward into the dust, ending the gunfight as abruptly as it had begun. In exactly 5 terrifying, deeply violent seconds, Dallas Staudenmayer had utilized his brilliant, customized tactical clothing, his unparalleled understanding of combat physics, and his absolute, sociopathic lack of hesitation to completely dominate a chaotic, multi-shooter ambush, leaving 4 men dead in the street, and instantly establishing an iron-fisted, terrifyingly absolute reign over the city of El Paso. But Staudenmayer's violent, overwhelming dominance over the incredibly corrupt, blood-soaked streets was not a permanent, peaceful resolution, but rather the explosive beginning of a terrifying, deeply paranoid, psychological war of attrition that would eventually consume his entire existence, completely shattering his mind and driving him toward an inevitable, highly kinetic destruction. The local criminal syndicate, heavily funded by illegal operations and deeply enraged by the loss of their political control, recognized that they could absolutely never defeat the towering, heavily armed marshal in a fair, face-to-face shootout, forcing them to utilize cowardly, shadow-based ambush tactics and constantly placing massive, highly lucrative bounties on Staudenmayer's head. For months, the lawman lived in a state of constant, suffocating hypervigilance, unable to trust a single soul, surviving multiple terrifying assassination attempts that included hidden snipers firing heavy rifle rounds through the windows of local saloons, and desperate, knife-wielding assassins lunging from dark alleyways in the dead of night. All of which Staudenmayer neutralized with his trademark, overwhelming brutality. To cope with the massive, crushing neurological weight of constant adrenaline spikes and the terrifying reality that every single shadow concealed a potential killer, Staudenmayer turned aggressively and completely to heavy, unadulterated frontier whiskey, consuming massive quantities of the toxic alcohol in a desperate, ultimately futile attempt to silence the demons of his Civil War past and the overwhelming paranoia of his present. The heavy drinking exponentially amplified his already terrifying, explosive temper, completely eroding whatever microscopic fragments of diplomatic restraint he possessed, turning him into a heavily armed, highly unpredictable ticking time bomb, who frequently used the heavy iron barrels of his revolvers to viciously pistol whip anyone who dared to cross him, further alienating the frightened city council that had initially hired him. His ultimate, fatal collision course was set when he entered into a massive, blood-soaked feud with the notorious Manning brothers, a deeply entrenched, highly dangerous family of local enforcers and political operators who controlled the underground economy of El Paso and viewed the unstable marshal as a direct, existential threat to their lucrative criminal empire. The tension between Staudenmayer and the Mannings escalated into a series of incredibly violent, highly publicized verbal confrontations and physical altercations that paralyzed the entire city, culminating in a deeply flawed, highly suspicious peace treaty orchestrated by terrified local citizens who desperately forced the heavily armed men to publicly shake hands and falsely promise an end to the hostilities. But on a sweltering September afternoon, the fragile, incredibly tense illusion of peace was completely shattered when an heavily intoxicated, deeply paranoid Staudenmayer aggressively confronted the Manning brothers inside a crowded local saloon. A fatal miscalculation that instantly ignited a chaotic, highly complex, and brutally efficient execution designed specifically to neutralize the frontier's most dangerous predator. As the argument rapidly deteriorated into screaming threats, a massive, explosive, physical struggle ensued, with Doc Manning desperately drawing his hidden weapon and firing a heavy lead projectile that violently impacted Staudenmayer's left arm, instantly shattering the bone and sending a massive, agonizing shockwave of pure pain through the lawman's entire central nervous system. In the absolute peak of terrifying, close-quarters chaos, Staudenmayer's deeply ingrained biomechanical combat reflexes automatically engaged, ignoring the agonizing trauma as he flawlessly drew his heavy Smith & Wesson revolver and fired a deeply concussive round that completely missed Doc Manning, but instantly dropped an innocent bystander, further plunging the saloon into absolute, terrifying pandemonium. As Staudenmayer violently wrestled with his attackers, desperately trying to bring the heavy iron barrel of his weapon to bear while blood poured from his shattered arm, the sheer, overwhelming tactical disadvantage of fighting multiple armed combatants in a deeply confined space finally caught up with the legendary gunfighter. Jim Manning, cowardly positioning himself behind the towering, heavily wounded marshal, coldly and mathematically calculated his shot, leveled his heavy revolver, and squeezed the trigger, unleashing a massive, high-velocity projectile that violently impacted the back of Staudenmayer's head, instantly and permanently severing his brainstem and completely shutting down his biological functions before his massive body even hit the wooden floorboards. The death of Dallas Staudenmayer was a brutal, highly unceremonious, and deeply tragic end for a man who had utilized brilliant, physics-defying tactical innovations and absolute uncompromising violence to completely tame one of the most dangerous cities on the American frontier, perfectly illustrating the horrifying, inescapable reality that in a world governed entirely by heavy lead and raw kinetic energy, even the most mechanically proficient, apex predator will eventually succumb to the sheer, overwhelming mathematics of a multi-shooter ambush, leaving behind a complex, heavily blood-stained legacy that forces us to question whether the men who wore the silver badges were truly the saviors of the West, or simply a more efficient, legally sanctioned breed of terrifying monsters. Imagine being told, from the exact moment you took your very first breath on this earth, that you were absolutely nothing more than a piece of property, a biological machine designed solely to endure brutal, back-breaking labor beneath the suffocating, unforgiving heat of the southern sun. Born to enslaved parents in 1838 in the rugged, unforgiving landscape of Crawford County, Arkansas. Imagine growing up in an environment so completely saturated in extreme physical and psychological violence that your only options were to either submit and let your spirit be entirely crushed into dust, or to silently, methodically forge yourself into something so incredibly hard, so overwhelmingly dangerous, that no man would ever dare to put you in chains again. Starting at the absolute bottom, as a lowly water boy, before being forced into grueling physical labor as a field hand alongside your captive parents. They were told that this man, who was officially owned by a ruthless master named William Reeves, and later inherited by his son George Reeves, who dragged him directly into the blood-soaked, mechanized slaughter of Civil War battlefields, was biologically inferior, destined to be a forgotten footnote in the chaotic history of the American frontier. They were completely unaware that they had actually bred a terrifying apex predator, a man who would eventually utilize his deep, traumatic understanding of human cruelty to become the single most prolific, technologically efficient, and completely unstoppable manhunter in the entire history of the American West. Before we completely tear away the sanitized, politically correct layers of this incredible historical narrative and dissect the terrifyingly precise, deeply psychological warfare tactics of a lawman who single-handedly brought over 3,000 heavily armed criminals to face brutal frontier justice, I need to know exactly who is riding with us into the absolute darkness of the Indian Territory today. So I want you to drop your city in the comments below right now to map out our global battalion, proving to the digital machine that our squad of uncompromising truth seekers demands the raw, violently unfiltered reality of history. We are violently ripping open the classified, deeply legendary file on Bass Reeves, a man whose entire existence was a profound, physics-defying middle finger to the incredibly rigid, highly racist societal structures of the 19th century. Following the absolute chaos of the Civil War and the eventual abolition of slavery around 1865, Reeves finally gained his freedom and returned to Arkansas, quietly establishing himself as a humble farmer near Van Buren, starting a family with his wife Nellie Jenny that would eventually grow to include 11 children. But a man forged in the absolute fires of hell cannot simply remain a quiet farmer, especially when the sprawling, unmapped, and completely lawless void known as the Indian Territory was located right next door. A massive expanse of rugged land that served as a dumping ground for the most violent, psychotic, and heavily armed fugitives fleeing federal jurisdiction. In this absolute nightmare landscape, where the average life expectancy for a stranger was measured in hours rather than years, Reeves did not just survive. He completely adapted, mathematically analyzing the survival tactics of the local tribes, mastering several complex tribal languages, and developing a deep, intimate understanding of the brutal, unforgiving terrain. When the legendary, iron-fisted Judge Isaac Parker took over the federal court in 1875 with an absolute mandate to clean up the territory, he ordered his head deputy, U.S. Marshal James F. Fagan, to hire the most capable, hardened trackers available. Fagan immediately sought out Reeves, heavily recruiting him because of his unprecedented, encyclopedic knowledge of the territory and his invaluable linguistic skills, making a highly controversial, incredibly unprecedented tactical decision to pin a silver badge to his chest and officially commission him as the very first black deputy United States Marshal west of the Mississippi River. Reeves fully understood that his skin color made him a massive, highly visible target for every single racist outlaw, former Confederate soldier, and corrupt local official in the territory. But he was a supreme tactical genius, a master of psychological warfare who brilliantly weaponized the extreme prejudice of his enemies, frequently disguising his towering physical frame to look like a completely harmless cowboy, a broken-down farmer, or even a desperate, heavily pursued outlaw himself. Instead of riding into a hostile camp, wearing a shiny badge and demanding surrender, which would have instantly resulted in a massive mathematically unsurvivable firefight, he would utilize these brilliant undercover disguises to slowly infiltrate heavily fortified hideouts, feigning exhaustion, utilizing the local criminal slang, and patiently building deep psychological rapport with the exact men he was hunting, sitting around their campfires and meticulously analyzing their weapons and their combat readiness. Amazingly, despite his incredible cognitive abilities and his unmatched tactical brilliance, Reeves was completely illiterate, a massive disadvantage that he overcame by developing a terrifying, almost supernatural photographic memory, allowing him to have someone read massive stacks of complex legal warrants to him just once, perfectly memorizing the exact phonetic sounds, the specific charges, and the visual shape of the ink on the paper, ensuring he never once arrested the wrong man. The absolute climax of his terrifying, highly technical reign over the Indian Territory, the specific moment that perfectly illustrates his unparalleled biomechanical speed and his cold, calculating understanding of close-quarters combat physics, occurred in 1889, during his legendary, high-stakes pursuit of a notorious, heavily armed horse thief and murderer named Tom Story. Story was an incredibly dangerous, deeply paranoid apex predator who had established a heavily fortified smuggling route in Texas. But Reeves did not simply stumble blindly into the kill zone. He utilized his massive intelligence network and his deep knowledge of the terrain to mathematically predict Story's exact movements, silently positioning himself directly along the outlaw's known route and setting a completely inescapable, deeply tactical ambush. When Story finally rode into the area, completely confident in his dominant position, Reeves stepped out from the shadows, completely surprising the terrified outlaw and coldly presenting him with the federal arrest warrant. Story, paralyzed by the sudden, deeply shocking appearance of the legendary Lawmen, made the ultimate, fatal miscalculation, entirely panicking and foolishly dropping his hand toward the heavy iron grip of his holstered revolver, desperately attempting to beat the towering marshal in a raw, kinetic contest of speed. In the exact millisecond that Story's shoulder muscles tensed, telegraphing his violent intentions, Reeves executed a flawless, physics-defying kinetic response, utilizing the explosive gemis, biomechanical power of his shoulder and forearm to draw his own weapon in one single, mathematically perfect, unbreakable blur of motion, proving to be exponentially faster on the draw and unleashing a massive, deeply concussive lead projectile that traveled hundreds of feet per second across the dusty expanse, violently impacting Tom Story's torso and shooting him absolutely dead before the outlaw's revolver had even cleared the leather of his holster. The massive kinetic energy of the heavy round instantly shattered Story's skeletal structure, completely shutting down his central nervous system and dropping him, entirely lifeless, into the dirt. An incredibly precise, devastatingly lethal, underdog victory of brilliant tactical positioning, advanced biomechanical speed, and absolute, sociopathic lack of hesitation over a man who had arrogantly believed he held the ultimate advantage. Over his incredible, 3-decade-long career, Bass Reeves survived countless point-blank shootouts, demonstrating an unyielding, almost terrifying moral compass that refused to yield to corruption, bringing an absolutely staggering total of over 3,000 fugitives to justice, and legally executing 14 dangerous outlaws in direct, brutal self-defense. This unyielding, absolute adherence to the rigid framework of the law was ultimately proven beyond any shadow of a doubt when Reeves was handed a federal warrant for his own biological son, forcing the aging lawman to make an incredibly dark, emotionally devastating decision that would have completely broken a lesser man. Demonstrating a level of rigid, terrifying psychological control that borders on the supernatural, Reeves calmly accepted the warrant, tracked his own flesh and blood across the unforgiving frontier, placed him in heavy iron shackles, and personally arrested him, proving to the entire world that his badge was absolutely heavier than blood, and his dedication to justice was entirely absolute. A dedication he maintained even after Oklahoma gained statehood, continuing to serve as a heavily respected police officer in Muskogee until his death in 1910. We are currently fighting a massive, deeply existential war against a cold, calculating, algorithmic machine that actively wants to erase this ugly, brutal, incredibly complex truth of human history. A highly sanitized digital matrix that constantly tries to feed you watered-down, historically inaccurate, perfectly packaged slop, deliberately designed to keep you entirely numb, comfortably ignorant, and completely compliant with their fake narratives. But we absolutely, fundamentally refuse to let the true, raw, blood-soaked history of the American frontier fade quietly into the dark, digital abyss of forgotten memory. Because we are the ultimate keepers of the flame. The men who still deeply respect the complex mechanics of survival, who remember the harsh smell of black powder, and who understand the terrifying reality of a world completely without rules. The only conceivable way we defeat this massive algorithmic suppression, the only way we ensure that these incredible, deeply technical stories of human survival and tragedy are preserved for the next generation, is if you take this exact video and aggressively share it with every single person you know. Blast it across every corner of the internet. Force the digital system to acknowledge our massive presence, and let them know with absolute certainty that we are not going anywhere and we will not be silenced. I need you to go down into the comment section right now, look the digital beast directly in the eye, and type the words, "We hold the line." Imagine being told that the absolute defining symbol of American frontier justice, the legendary, long-haired hero whose striking face was plastered across thousands of romanticized dime novels as the ultimate shining protector of the innocent, was actually a deeply paranoid, highly volatile, and mathematically precise executioner who frequently shot completely unarmed men, routinely instigated massive, blood-soaked gunfights over incredibly petty gambling disputes, and viewed the heavy silver badge pinned to his chest not as a noble burden of civilized society, but as a highly weaponized shield that granted him absolute, unquestioned legal immunity to commit outright murder. They were told to look at this towering, beautifully dressed figure with his perfectly oiled hair and his twin ivory-handled revolvers as a flawless knight of the wild plains, completely unaware that they were actually staring at a ruthlessly calculating apex predator whose entire mythological existence was meticulously constructed on top of a mountain of shattered skulls and massive, highly orchestrated public relations lies. Before we completely dismantle the shiny, artificial Hollywood mythology surrounding the most famous, heavily dramatized lawman in the entire history of the American West, and expose the incredibly dark, physically exhausting, and terrifyingly paranoid reality of his daily existence, I need to know exactly who is still holding the perimeter with us in this deep historical trench. So I want you to drop your city in the comments below right now to solidify our global battalion, proving to the highly sanitized digital algorithms that our squad of hardcore truth seekers demands the raw, violent, unvarnished reality of the frontier. We are violently ripping the cover off the incredibly complex, deeply blood-stained file of James Butler Hickok, globally immortalized under the terrifying moniker of Wild Bill, a man born in Illinois in 1837 who migrated to the bleeding month, chaotic edge of the frontier and quickly realized that in a completely lawless vacuum, a man's reputation for absolute down, uncontrollable violence was the single most effective piece of body armor he could ever possibly wear. Hickok did not simply stumble into his legendary status. He actively, brilliantly engineered it, utilizing his time as a heavily armed scout and spy for the Union Army during the brutal, mechanized slaughter of the Civil War to master the complex biomechanical arts of stealth, reconnaissance, and extreme close-quarters annihilation, transforming his biological responses to fear and adrenaline into a cold, perfectly calibrated engine of destruction. Following the war, Hickok understood with terrifying clarity that the frontier was heavily populated by deeply traumatized, highly aggressive young men looking to make a name for themselves by killing an established legend, forcing him to adopt a lifestyle of extreme, suffocating hypervigilance that would have completely shattered the mind of a normal human being. To survive the constant, daily threat of a cowardly ambush, Hickok implemented a series of rigid, heavily paranoid tactical protocols, absolutely refusing to ever walk near the edges of buildings where assassins could easily hide in the shadows, instead choosing to march directly down the absolute center of the dusty, sun-baked streets, forcing any potential attacker to face him openly in the devastatingly lethal kill zone of the open thoroughfare. When he finally allowed himself to rest in a hotel room, he would meticulously scatter crushed glass or crumpled newspaper completely across the wooden floorboards to serve as an improvised, highly sensitive early warning acoustic alarm system. And he would sleep with a massive, fully loaded double-barreled shotgun resting directly across his chest, mathematically calculating that even in a state of deep unconsciousness, his raw, primal muscle memory could unleash a devastating payload of buckshot at the first sound of a creaking door. But his absolute, ultimate tactical advantage, the mechanical innovation that made him the most feared physical entity on the Western Plains, was his brilliant, highly unorthodox method of carrying his weapons. Famously tucking two massive, heavily modified 36 caliber Colt Navy revolvers directly into a red silk sash wrapped tightly around his waist, with the heavy iron butts pointing outward in a reversed position. This completely bypassed the incredibly slow, highly restrictive physical mechanics of a traditional holster draw, allowing Hickok to execute a terrifyingly fast, deeply fluid reverse cross draw known as the plains draw, sweeping his hands across his body and snapping the heavy barrels up to eye level in a microscopic fraction of a second, perfectly aligning the iron sights with his target before the enemy's brain could even process the sudden blur of motion. The absolute, undeniable climax of his incredibly violent career, the specific moment that essentially birthed the entire modern concept of the Hollywood quick-draw duel and cemented his terrifying dominance over the frontier, occurred in 1865 in the tense, heavily divided town of Springfield, Missouri, following a deeply bitter, incredibly petty dispute with a rival gambler and former Confederate soldier named Davis Tutt over a meager poker debt and a confiscated gold pocket watch. When Tutt arrogantly paraded across the crowded town square wearing Hickok's prized gold watch, actively attempting to publicly humiliate the legendary gunfighter, Hickok coldly recognized that allowing this massive insult to go unpunished would instantly shatter his carefully constructed aura of invincibility and invite hundreds of ambitious challengers to try their luck, forcing him to completely neutralize the threat with maximum undeniable prejudice. As the terrified civilian population rapidly evacuated the sun-drenched square, leaving the two heavily armed men facing each other across an incredibly vast, mathematically improbable distance of exactly 75 yards, a distance that was considered absolutely impossible for a highly inaccurate, smooth-bore black powder revolver, the heavy, suffocating silence of the frontier descended upon the town. Tutt, completely overwhelmed by the massive surge of raw adrenaline and sheer panic, abruptly drew his weapon and fired a desperate, wildly inaccurate shot that screamed harmlessly through the humid air, totally failing to calculate the complex trajectory required for such an extreme distance. Hickok, possessing a terrifying, sociopathic level of combat calm, did not flinch, did not panic, and did not aggressively yank his trigger. Instead, he flawlessly executed a highly advanced, deeply technical marksman stance, drawing his heavy Colt Navy, turning his body perfectly sideways to present the smallest possible biological target, and calmly resting the heavy iron barrel of his revolver directly across his opposite forearm to create a completely stable, mechanically rigid firing platform. In a display of mathematical precision that absolutely defied the primitive technology of the era, Hickok took a fraction of a second to completely stabilize his own heart rate, softly exhaled, and squeezed the trigger, unleashing a heavy lead projectile that that traveled across the massive 75-yard expanse and violently impacted Davis Tutt squarely in the absolute center of his chest, piercing his heart and dropping him completely dead in the dust. An impossible, physics-defying underdog victory of cold, calculated science over blind, aggressive panic. This legendary, incredibly brutal execution instantly propelled Hickok to a godlike status, leading to highly lucrative, deeply corrupt appointments as the marshal of famously violent cowtowns like Hayes City and Abilene, where he utilized his massive reputation to rule the streets with an iron fist, completely bypassing the slow, bureaucratic process of trials and juries by simply executing troublemakers on the spot, shooting highly intoxicated cowboys who dared to fire their weapons in his jurisdiction, and violently pistol whipping anyone who questioned his absolute authority. However, the crushing, inescapable psychological weight of constantly operating as a heavily armed apex predator in an environment completely devoid of trust eventually triggered a catastrophic, deeply tragic failure of his highly calibrated nervous system during a chaotic, multi-shooter firefight outside the Alamo Saloon in Abilene. As Hickok aggressively engaged an angry mob of heavily armed Texas cowboys, quickly drawing his weapons and unleashing a devastating barrage of high-velocity lead to neutralize the immediate threat, he detected a rapid, unexpected movement out of his peripheral vision, violently snapping his heavy revolver toward the approaching shadow and firing a deeply concussive, instantly lethal shot directly into the head of the man rushing toward him. When the thick, choking cloud of acrid black powder smoke finally cleared, Hickok stared in absolute, mind-shattering horror as he realized his terrifyingly fast, completely uncontrollable combat reflexes had just murdered his own incredibly loyal deputy, Mike Williams. A catastrophic, highly traumatic friendly fire incident that completely broke the legendary lawman's spirit, fundamentally shattering his confidence and causing him to permanently surrender his badge, never again taking a job in frontier law enforcement. In the final, deeply tragic years of his life, the great Wild Bill Hickok was reduced to a terrifyingly paranoid, rapidly aging ghost of his former glory. His incredibly sharp, legendary eyesight heavily failing due to the onset of severe glaucoma, forcing the man who had once mathematically dominated the frontier from 75 yards away to squint heavily just to recognize the faces of the men sitting directly across the poker table from him. Seeking one final, desperate payday in the chaotic, gold-crazed camp of Deadwood, in the lawless Dakota Territory, Hickok walked into Nuttall and Mann's saloon on a sweltering August afternoon in 1876, completely exhausted by a lifetime of hypervigilance, and made the single, fatal, biomechanical error that he had spent his entire adult life aggressively avoiding. Finding the poker table completely full, the legendary, deeply paranoid gunfighter violated his own absolute, cardinal rule of survival and reluctantly took the only available chair. A deeply compromised position that placed his broad, highly recognizable back squarely toward the swinging wooden doors of the saloon, completely blinding his failing eyes to the lethal geometry of the room behind him. It was in this incredibly rare, highly tragic moment of physical exhaustion and compromised tactical positioning that a deeply bitter, cowardly drifter named Jack McCall quietly slipped through the doors. A man who would have never survived a microscopic fraction of a second in a face-to-face confrontation with the legendary killer, but who fully understood that raw kinetic energy does not care about legendary status or historical reputation. McCall silently drew a heavy, double-action .45 caliber revolver, crept up directly behind the greatest tactical genius of the American West, and cowardly fired a massive lead projectile straight into the back of Hickok's skull at point-blank range, instantly and permanently shutting down the incredible biological supercomputer that had survived dozens of massive frontier shootouts, ending his life while his hands still tightly gripped a legendary poker hand containing black aces and eights, forever immortalized as the dead man's hand. The brutal, highly unceremonious execution of Wild Bill Hickok perfectly encapsulates the terrifying, deeply uncomfortable reality of the American frontier, completely destroying the Hollywood illusion of honorable high noon duels, and proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that in a world governed entirely by physics, velocity, and sheer, unfiltered violence, no amount of advanced tactical skill, biomechanical superiority, or terrifying public reputation can ever truly protect a man from a coward operating in the shadows. We are currently fighting a massive, deeply existential war against a cold, calculating, algorithmic machine that actively wants to erase this ugly, brutal, incredibly complex truth of human history. A highly sanitized digital matrix that constantly tries to feed you watered-down, historically inaccurate, perfectly packaged slop, deliberately designed to keep you entirely numb, comfortably ignorant, and completely compliant with their fake narratives. But we absolutely, fundamentally refuse to let the true, raw, blood-soaked history of the American frontier fade quietly into the dark, digital abyss of forgotten memory. Because we are the ultimate keepers of the flame. The men who still deeply respect the complex mechanics of survival, who remember the harsh smell of black powder, and who understand the terrifying reality of a world completely without rules. The only conceivable way we defeat this massive algorithmic suppression, the only way we ensure that these incredible, deeply technical stories of human survival and tragedy are preserved for the next generation, is if you take this exact video and aggressively share it with every single person you know, blast it across every corner of the internet, force the digital system to acknowledge our massive presence, and let them know with absolute certainty that we are not going anywhere and we will not be silenced. I need you to go down into the comments section right now, look the digital beast directly in the eye, and type the words, "We hold the line."